Imagine waking up one morning to find that the very people meant to protect your neighborhood were secretly plotting against you. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were rewriting them, targeting one homeowner with petty fines, threats, and humiliating notices designed to push him out of his own property. But what they didn't expect was how far he'd go to fight back, and the stunning chain of events that would follow. What happens when power, pride, and revenge collide in the quiet streets of suburbia? At first glance, the neighborhood looked like the kind of place people dreamed of living in. Neatly trimmed lawns, quiet tree-lined streets, and a row of houses that all seemed to glow in the evening sun. For most residents, this was a picture of order and security, a place where families felt proud to belong. Among them was Daniel, a man who had worked for years to own a home here. It wasn't a mansion, but it was his pride. A modest two-story house with a wide porch, freshly painted shutters, and a backyard where his kids chased each other until the stars came out. Daniel had moved here for peace, stability, and the promise of community. He believed that this neighborhood was the reward for all his hard work. In the beginning, life was good. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. The air was filled with the scent of fresh-cut grass and weekend barbecues. Daniel enjoyed sitting on his porch in the evenings, sipping coffee while watching his children ride their bikes down the quiet lane. The Homeowners Association, at least on the surface, seemed like a system meant to protect this harmony. They maintained the common areas, enforced basic rules, and promised to keep the neighborhood safe and beautiful. But beneath the polished image of order and unity, small cracks were already beginning to show. Daniel noticed them in hushed conversations between neighbors, in the way people glanced nervously at the HOA board members during meetings, and in the quiet complaints whispered behind closed doors. Most ignored these signs, convincing themselves that the rules were only there for the greater good. For Daniel, those first months felt almost idyllic. He planted flowers by the walkway, installed a small swing set in the backyard, and even built a raised garden bed where his wife could grow tomatoes and herbs. It was their little sanctuary, a corner of the world they finally controlled. But what Daniel didn't realize was that control in this neighborhood didn't belong to the homeowners. It belonged to the HOA. And the HOA was watching everything. At first, the notices seemed harmless, reminders to trim a hedge or warnings about trash bins left visible from the street. Daniel didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood had rules, but the pattern grew impossible to ignore. Each week, another envelope appeared in his mailbox. The tone shifted from polite reminders to sharp warnings, each one more aggressive than the last. The HOA didn't like his garden bed. They didn't like the color of his shutters. They didn't like the placement of his swing set, even though it was hidden behind a fence. No matter what he did, it was never enough. What had once been a home of comfort began to feel like a trap, every small detail scrutinized, every personal choice challenged. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had been singled out, and in a way, he was right. The board had set their sights on him, though he didn't yet understand why. Maybe it was because he was new, maybe it was because someone on the board didn't like him, or maybe, just maybe, the HOA had grown too comfortable with its power and Daniel had become their latest target. He didn't know it yet, but these petty notices were only the beginning. What started as small irritations was about to spiral into something much bigger, much uglier, and far more dangerous than Daniel could have ever imagined. First notice might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. A simple letter tucked into Daniel's mailbox, politely reminding him that his trash bin had been left out too long after pickup day. He shrugged it off. Mistakes happen. But the second letter came just days later, this one pointing out that his grass was half an inch higher than the HOA's standards. Half an inch, that detail burned into his mind. It was the first sign that this wasn't about maintaining order, it was about control. Soon the envelopes multiplied. Each one carried the same sharp, bureaucratic tone, written as though Daniel were not a homeowner but a trespasser in his own property. He was fined for the color of his shutters, a soft blue that had been painted long before he moved in. He was fined for the small raised garden bed his wife had built, even though it was hidden behind a fence and disturbed no one. He was fined for his children's swing set, labeled an unauthorized structure, despite being a harmless source of joy in their backyard. The more he tried to comply, the worse it became. Daniel trimmed his hedges, repainted the shutters, and even moved the swing set further back into the yard. None of it mattered. Another letter arrived, then another. Every correction seemed to invite two more violations, as if the board was inventing new rules just for him. At first, Daniel's neighbors sympathized. They whispered their own frustrations in hushed tones. One family admitted they had been fined for planting the wrong type of flowers. Another said the board had demanded they remove a bird feeder. But when Daniel pressed them to stand up to the HOA, their voices grew quiet. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others simply warned him not to make waves. That's when Daniel realized people here lived in fear. And he was starting to understand why. The HOA wasn't just a board of volunteers. It was a small group of people who had convinced themselves they were rulers. They monitored every property, prowled the streets with clipboards, and wielded power with ruthless efficiency. If you resisted, they buried you in paperwork, fees, and threats of legal action. Daniel had heard whispers that one family even lost their home after refusing to comply with escalating fines. No one spoke about them anymore, as if they'd been erased from the neighborhood. That chilling thought kept Daniel awake at night. His home, his sanctuary, suddenly felt fragile. He had worked for years to build this life, and now it seemed the HOA could strip it all away with a stroke of a pen. But Daniel wasn't the type to back down. When the next notice came, this one demanding he tear down the garden bed within 10 days or face escalating fines, Daniel refused. He left the garden where it was. His wife tended it every morning, and his children had helped plant the seeds. It was more than just a box of soil, it was a piece of their life, and Daniel was determined to protect it. That defiance set off a storm. The board sent letter after letter, each one more hostile. They accused him of willful noncompliance. They threatened daily fines. They even hinted at legal action, claiming his continued violations could lead to liens placed against his property. The intimidation was relentless. Daniel's wife grew anxious. His children overheard conversations and began asking questions no parent wants to answer. Are we going to lose our house? The stress began to seep into every part of his life. Daniel stopped sleeping, lying awake imagining worst-case scenarios. He felt watched, as if the HOA board members were waiting outside, waiting for him to slip up. And in a way they were. One evening, as Daniel returned home from work, he noticed a car idling across the street. Inside sat one of the board members, scribbling on a clipboard, eyes fixed on Daniel's property. That was the moment Daniel knew this wasn't just about rules, this was personal. Instead of backing down, Daniel began documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every interaction. He took photos of his property, measured his lawn, and kept meticulous records. He refused to give them the satisfaction of compliance. The board wanted submission, but Daniel was preparing for a fight. And the fight was about to escalate in ways he never imagined. Weeks later, a certified letter arrived. This wasn't a warning. It was a notice of intent to place a lien on Daniel's home. If he didn't comply, the HOA claimed it had the authority to seize his property. His heart pounded as he read the words over and over, trying to process the reality. They weren't just threatening him anymore, they were moving to take the very roof from over his family's head. Daniel's wife broke down in tears. His children clung to him, sensing the fear in the air. But Daniel felt something else, fury. The HOA had crossed a line. This wasn't about grass or shutters or garden beds anymore. This was about power, greed, and intimidation. Instead of folding, Daniel took his case to the next level. He hired an attorney, a sharp, relentless professional who specialized in property disputes. Together, they began preparing a counterattack. Daniel's meticulous documentation became his weapon. Every photo, every notice, every arbitrary rule was stacked like ammunition, waiting to be unleashed. The HOA board, however, was not intimidated. They doubled down. Meetings became spectacles where board members openly mocked him, painting him as a troublemaker in front of the community. Letters were sent not just to Daniel but to his neighbors, warning them about his disruptive behavior. The goal was clear: isolate him, break him, and make an example out of him. But Daniel's resolve only grew stronger. He showed up to meetings not as a defeated homeowner but as a man ready to expose their corruption. He spoke calmly, armed with facts, while the board seethed with frustration. The more he resisted, the more desperate they became. Then came the breaking point. One night, Daniel returned home to find his garden bed destroyed. The wood was torn apart, the soil scattered, the plants ripped from their roots. His children's swing set had been vandalized, the chains cut clean through. No letter explained this. No fine accompanied it. This wasn't the HOA acting through paper and ink. This was raw intimidation carried out in the shadows. Daniel stood in the wreckage of his backyard, his fists clenched, his heart pounding. Someone had crossed into his property, violated his home, and sent a message that couldn't be ignored. His wife begged him to let it go, fearing for their safety. But Daniel knew this was no longer just about him. It was about every homeowner who had been silenced, every family living in fear of the board's power. He swore he would not only fight back, he would expose them. And what happened next would shake the entire neighborhood, dragging hidden secrets into the light and forcing everyone to choose a side. Because when Daniel struck back, he wouldn't do it quietly. He was about to turn the HOA's own rules against them, and in the process, reveal just how fragile their empire of control really was. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday evening when the HOA scheduled a special meeting at the community center. Officially, it was to discuss compliance issues affecting neighborhood harmony. Unofficially, everyone knew what it really was, Daniel's trial. By the time he arrived, the room was already packed. Neighbors filled the rows of folding chairs, whispering nervously, casting glances his way. At the front, the HOA board sat in a long row, faces tight with self-importance, papers stacked like weapons in front of them. Their president, a sharp-eyed man named Harris, leaned forward as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Daniel felt the weight of every stare, but he walked straight to the microphone. In his hand was a thick binder, the documentation he'd spent weeks compiling. Every notice, every photo, every rule twisted against him. Tonight he was done playing defense. The board began with their usual theatrics. They accused him of being a chronic violator. They listed off every so-called infraction: the garden bed, the swing set, the shutter color, the grass height, each one punctuated with threats of fines and legal action. Harris's voice dripped with condescension, painting Daniel as a menace to the very fabric of the neighborhood. When they finished, the room fell silent, waiting for Daniel's response. He didn't hesitate. Daniel opened his binder and began reading aloud. He started with the first notice, then the second, then the third. He flipped through photographs showing how his grass had been trimmed to regulation length, how the shutters had been painted in an approved shade, how the garden bed had violated no written rule in the HOA's handbook. He laid out timelines, dates, and contradictions, each one a nail driven into the board's case. Murmurs spread through the audience. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering to one another, realization dawning on their faces. This wasn't about community harmony, this was about harassment. But Daniel wasn't finished. From the bottom of his binder, he pulled a letter, one the board hadn't expected to see. His attorney had filed a formal complaint with the State Housing Authority, outlining a pattern of discrimination, targeted harassment, and abuse of power by the HOA. If the board continued their actions, they wouldn't just face community backlash, they would face legal consequences. The board shifted uncomfortably. Harris's smug grin faltered, but Daniel pressed on. Then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel raised a set of photos taken just days earlier: the vandalism of his backyard, the destroyed garden bed, the swing set cut down. He showed them to the audience, his voice cracking with anger as he described the violation of his family's safe space. This isn't about rules, this is about intimidation. Someone stepped onto my property and tried to break me. His words echoed through the room, heavy and undeniable. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then slowly voices began to rise. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for months finally spoke. One woman admitted she'd been fined hundreds of dollars for planting tulips that didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. A man said he'd been threatened with foreclosure for painting his garage door a shade too dark. One by one, the stories poured out, and the board's carefully built image of authority began to crumble in front of everyone. Daniel stepped back, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. He didn't need to scream, he didn't need to beg. The truth was finally speaking for itself. Harris tried to regain control. He slammed his gavel, his voice rising, accusing Daniel of orchestrating chaos, of poisoning the community spirit. But the crowd no longer listened. Murmurs turned to shouts. Neighbors demanded answers, demanded accountability. For the first time, the board was on the defensive. And then came the final blow. Daniel's attorney, who had quietly slipped into the back of the room, stood and addressed the board directly. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. He announced that legal action was already in motion, not just against the board but against individual members who had abused their positions. Every threatening letter, every baseless fine, every act of harassment could now be scrutinized in court. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one in front of a judge. The color drained from Harris's face. The board members shifted uneasily, their confidence evaporating. The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in something closer to relief. For the first time, they saw that the HOA wasn't untouchable. Daniel stood at the microphone, his binder still in hand, his heart pounding. Months of fear, frustration, and humiliation had led to this moment, and now the power had shifted. The board wasn't in control anymore. He looked directly at Harris, his voice steady. "You tried to take my home, you tried to silence me, but you forgot something. This neighborhood doesn't belong to you, it belongs to all of us." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The board adjourned the meeting in chaos, their authority shattered. Neighbors left buzzing with energy, some patting Daniel on the back, others thanking him for standing up. But Daniel knew this wasn't the end. Legal battles still loomed. Retaliation was still possible. The war wasn't won. But for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in months: hope. And as he walked out of that crowded room, binder under his arm, he realized something else. the HOA had made one critical mistake. In trying to crush him, they had exposed themselves. The turning point had come, the fight wasn't over, but Daniel wasn't alone anymore. And what happened next would leave the HOA reeling in ways they never saw coming. The weeks that followed the explosive community meeting were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. For years, the HOA had ruled with unchecked authority, silencing dissent with fines and fear. But now, for the first time, their grip was slipping. Word spread quickly. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now openly discussed on sidewalks, at mailboxes, and in living rooms. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for so long suddenly found their voices. They shared their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and arbitrary punishment, and more importantly, they rallied behind Daniel. The HOA board tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. They sent out their usual notices reminding residents of upcoming fees, rules, and inspections. But the tone had shifted. Instead of trembling compliance, homeowners began questioning everything. Letters were ignored, meetings were challenged, and neighbors attended in record numbers. The board, once feared, now faced a crowd ready to hold them accountable. For Daniel, the change was both empowering and overwhelming. He had become a reluctant symbol, a homeowner who had stood up and refused to be broken. Strangers stopped him on the street to thank him. Families who had once avoided eye contact now greeted him warmly, but behind the support lingered the shadow of retaliation. The board didn't surrender easily. They pushed forward with their lien, insisting Daniel owed thousands in fines. They hired an attorney of their own, determined to paint him as a disruptive force bent on dismantling the neighborhood's order. The legal battle that followed was grueling, stretching on for months. But Daniel had something the HOA couldn't erase: evidence. His meticulous documentation, combined with the testimony of neighbors who had suffered similar treatment, painted a damning picture. In court, the board's arrogance worked against them. They couldn't defend the inconsistency of their rules, the selective enforcement, or the pattern of targeting specific families. Piece by piece, their case unraveled. The judge's ruling was clear. The fines levied against Daniel were unlawful. The lien was invalid. And perhaps most significantly, the court ordered an independent audit of the HOA's practices. The decision sent shockwaves through the community. For the first time, the board's power was not just challenged, it was legally dismantled. In the aftermath, several board members resigned under pressure. Harris, the president who had once wielded authority like a weapon, stepped down in disgrace. New elections were held, this time with unprecedented turnout. Homeowners who had once avoided HOA politics now campaigned openly, promising transparency and fairness. The neighborhood, once suffocated by fear, began to breathe again. For Daniel, the victory was more than personal. It was proof that one homeowner could make a difference, that standing up against abuse of power wasn't futile. But it had come at a cost. Months of stress had worn him down. His family had endured sleepless nights, constant anxiety, and the painful uncertainty of almost losing their home. Yet, as he sat once more on his porch, coffee in hand, children laughing in the yard, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The garden bed had been rebuilt, stronger than before. The swing set had been repaired, chains shining in the afternoon sun. These weren't just repairs, they were symbols of resilience. Neighbors began to gather again, this time not out of fear but out of unity. Barbecues returned, children played freely, and conversations flowed without the constant shadow of surveillance. The community was healing. And Daniel knew this was bigger than his own story. His fight had sparked something larger, a reminder that HOAs, no matter how powerful they seemed, were not above the people they served. They existed for the community, not the other way around. The long-term impact rippled beyond the neighborhood. Word spread to nearby communities, inspiring other homeowners to question their boards, to demand fairness, and to resist intimidation. Daniel's story became a cautionary tale for HOAs that abused their power and a beacon of hope for families who felt powerless against them. In the end, the HOA's greatest weapon, fear, had been broken, and in its place grew something far stronger: unity. Daniel often thought back to the night of the meeting, standing at that microphone with his binder in hand. He remembered the fear, the anger, and the uncertainty. But most of all, he remembered the moment when silence gave way to voices, when isolation turned into solidarity. That was the true victory. The HOA had tried to take his home. Instead, they gave him something far more valuable: the strength of a community and the proof that even in the face of intimidation, one voice could ignite change. And as the sun set over the quiet streets, Daniel realized that his neighborhood had finally become what he'd always hoped it would be, not just a place to live, but a place to belong.